Lovely. Okay, two tough acts to follow there. But so my name is Nick. I am the outreach coordinator and the founder of Project Wild CIC. Project Wild CIC is a not-for-profit that is all about trying to connect communities to green spaces. So my interest and my background is that I studied biology. From that, I specialized in ecology, and then went even further into that niche and went down the route of herpetology, which, for those of you who might know already, is specifically reptiles and amphibians. So quite a niche group, and particularly in the UK, when we have a real lack of both species. We only have 6 native species of reptile, and similar for the amphibians as well. So it's quite a small group, which means it's quite easy for me to learn a lot quite quickly. So a bit of context to the organization as a whole. We've worked with, to date, I think it's about 9,700 and something individual people across the 7 or 8 years that we've been running. And that's through a wide variety of different means. We do sort of guided surveys and take people out to sort of experience our local wildlife. We do kind of habitat improvement workshops. We do loads of workshops in schools. So this top photo here on the top right, if I just sort of circle around where that snake is Lucian. Lucian is a grass snake that was a rescue from one of our survey sites and has probably met somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 people across Yorkshire now as an ambassador to grass snakes, and he teaches people all about those lovely animals. And I believe I saw that John Cook was on this call, so hello John if that was you, but this bottom right image is at Stillingfleet Wildlife Day, doing some pond dipping there. So a whole mix of different programs and initiatives that we do. Currently, we're running projects like the Eco Leader course. So we're working with local schools and getting young people kind of trained up in environmental skills that we can then help them facilitate their own social action projects to improve green space and connect people with nature. So I get very excited about all things biodiversity, nature, animals, and that's really where my enthusiasm comes from. I'm not sure where it comes from because my parents absolutely hate snakes, spiders, and all that stuff, and I've fully gone against the grain and headed fully into that. So one of the driving factors behind doing this is actually this quote. So as it says here, if children don't grow up knowing about nature and appreciating it, they will not understand it. And if they don't understand it, they won't protect it. And if they don't protect it, who will? By, of course, David Attenborough. Now, this is very much what we use as our kind of background ethos at Project Wild. We predominantly work with young people, and it is all about education. Our school system, great in some ways that it is, doesn't do a very good job of actually teaching life sciences in the context of why it's important locally and how that affects us as individuals and as communities. I think where it excels is maybe teaching some of the theory, but it's all well and good learning about why a camel in a desert has evolved to be more efficient in terms of water use. But here in the UK, children actually can identify more Pokemon, which are obviously not a living creature, than they can our own native wildlife. It shocks me still when I go into primary schools and children can't identify like an oak leaf, for instance. But it's just not something that's taught anymore. So this is where we come in. We go into the schools. We do work alongside the curriculum, but we go way more in depth and teach them all about what's local to them and what matters and why that's exciting. And we integrate these skills into a whole bunch of different projects. I've seen Christine here as well. Hello, Christine. I do the Multiply project with Up for Yorkshire that goes through Better Connect. And that's all about math skills. But we do a lot of that through habitat improvements and sort of woodworking, maybe producing sort of bird boxes, hedgehog houses. And we can teach those math skills alongside integrating those skills that improve people's awareness of green spaces and their local biodiversity. So I'm going to try not to go on too long about this. I don't want to teach any of you things you already know. I'm sure a lot of you are quite savvy on sort of environmental aspects, as presumably being here, that's an area of interest. But I just want to quickly touch on some ecosystem dynamics and why it's important to have that background understanding and how that then feeds into how we can improve green spaces efficiently. So we often think of ecosystems in terms of the living animals that are there, the food chains and the food webs. And this diagram actually on the top right, this sort of really complicated series of circles and numbers and lines, is a more accurate representation of a food web than you would typically see. And as you can see, it's fairly complicated. You've got seals noted there as number 76, and I think cod's also marked off. So this is I think this is the Northwest Atlantic food web being represented by a model. And all of those numbers represent different organisms in the environment, and all of those interconnecting lines shows who's eating who, where the energy transfer is happening. So ecosystems are incredibly complex systems of different animal and plant and environmental interactions. And they've all evolved over thousands, millions of years to be relatively self-sustaining because they have to work in balance so that things can function, and that's how it is structured. So quick summary on this. I'm sure, as I say, I'm going to try and go through this quite quick because I think a lot of this is stuff you'll already be quite aware of. But within an ecosystem, we talk about biotic and abiotic factors. So biotic is alive, abiotic is not alive. It is really important that we consider all these things when we're thinking about how we can improve habitats. So the biotic factors are your plants, your animals, your fungi, your microorganisms. Abiotic factors is how much rainfall is there, how much sunlight reaches the ground, what's the geology of the area, what's the pH in the soil. All of these factors are incredibly important in understanding how that ecosystem will function. And all of those factors, as it says on that second point, are thoroughly interlinked through chemistry, physiology, those food webs I've mentioned, and those direct interactions between species like mutualisms, where they're benefiting each other, parasitisms, where one is taking from another. And all of these things collectively produce what should be a well-balanced and quite stable system. And as long as there is good biodiversity, it tends to be very stable and well-balanced. And as it says now on point 3 there, a more diverse habitat gives rise to more diversity. And this is kind of a fundamental point in how we can improve green spaces in a way that isn't too labor intensive. It often is at the start, but then it should carry on. Because if you get initial level diversity, you can actually, it naturally produces new niches, new environmental conditions for animals and plants to occupy. So from that point of view, if we wanted to create good ecosystems, what we would look to do is start at the ground level and be like, well, what can we directly do? And that's, we can improve soil quality, we can improve those abiotic factors in the ecosystem, and we can plant out a wide biodiversity of plant species. And that allows for a lot more things to flourish and thrive in those environments. So I mentioned there, you've got the words sort of specialist. Sorry, it's a bit shaky. I'm trying to write with my mouse, but there's specialists there and generalists. I'm sure they're terms most of us are familiar with. Specialists are organisms that specialize in very specific habitats. Specific specialists and generalists can occupy a wide variety of niches. And it's those factors that really help us determine how an ecosystem will thrive. I'm sure we're all aware of the oak tree. Does anyone know how many species an oak tree supports? If you have an oak tree in an environment, how many species can that support? I see shaking heads, so I'll tell you. Oh, sorry, Frank, is that?
It's thousands. It's mind-blowing.
It is extraordinary. It's about 2,300 specialist species will have relationships with an oak tree. So if you have a woodland with an oak tree or multiple oak trees, you've suddenly opened the door just by putting the oak tree there or planting it and letting it grow. You open the door to potentially 2,300 other species coming in to occupy that space. Whereas if you don't have the oak tree, so say you've either cut it down or it was never there to start with, those niches don't even exist for those animals to be there and those plants to be there. So that's 2,300 species you are cutting out from your habitat just by missing one tree. And Oak trees are the go-to example because they're one of our most sort of significant cultural and environmental icons, and they do support such a broad diversity of life. But actually, for every species of tree and almost every species of plant, there will be specialists. If I say the word wasp to you, most people imagine a little, black and yellow stinging insect that's a bit of a nuisance in summer. If you say wasp to an entomologist, they're going to be thinking of thousands of species of tiny, tiny little things that you can barely see, that range from sort of Pepsis wasps, so wasps that specialize in predating and parasitizing specific insects. So for almost every species of caterpillar, there is a dedicated species of wasp that will lay its eggs in that caterpillar, and they only do that species of caterpillar. For almost every tree, there will be specific wasps that will use the trees, and they produce something called a gall, where they can again lay their eggs. And most people are familiar with fig wasps, and it's essentially that, but to everything. And almost every plant you can imagine, or every insect you can imagine, has others that are directly connected to it. So that's what I mean by diversity gives rise to diversity. By having more things present, you open the door to so much more. And that final point at the bottom, disruptions to one factor will affect everything else in the system. And that's really where habitat management comes into play, and why it's so important that we maintain diversity. A lot of woodlands in the UK, as an example, are planted out with pine trees because it's a good sort of resource, it's fast growing, but it reduces the diversity of plant life and then has that knock-on effect of massively reducing the diversity of all other life. So I think I'm already getting too excited about everything and taking too long, so I'm going to try and speed through a bit more. Do give me a wave, Kate, if I'm taking too long. So if we're looking to improve an ecosystem, and like with what you're doing, Frank, with sort of rewilding areas, as I'm sure you're already aware and already doing, a lot of it is about getting those plants into place. So plants really shape our ecosystems. They're those foundational blocks of it, the producers in our food chains and food webs. So roots, of course, protect and secure soils, and it gives like floods alleviation as well. Plants can influence the pH of soils. So if you're wanting to change that, you can look at which plants you put in. Trees influence the amount of light reaching the ground, which in turn will influence what can grow on the ground level. So that ground flora that develops, and rotting vegetation adds nutrients. And as I mentioned there, like oak trees support over 2,300 other species. And I've also mentioned ragwort below, because ragwort's one of those really interesting ones that, particularly if any of you have horses or chickens, you're probably quite familiar with ragwort because it is toxic. And I'll touch on that in a moment as well, but it's one of those species that it's very divisive, I think, from a conservation point of view. So to recap that quickly, the high producer biodiversity is creating those niches for high consumer diversity. So we've gone over that quite thoroughly. If I'm going too fast, do say, but I am conscious of time, so I'm wanting to kind of step through it.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, we've probably got sort of 5 minutes till but people might be able to just stay around afterwards anyway. So, but yeah.
Okay. I will speed myself up a little bit and cut out some other things. So this is an example of a wood meadow. So a lot of woodlands through temperate Europe have big open meadow areas, and this is just an example of one of those really biodiverse habitats, because by having the relative complexity of having meadow and woodland, where you get different ground flora and the kind of edges between them where different things grow, you have very high plant biodiversity, and these actually, as habitats go, are some of the most biodiverse in the temperate Europe world. So moving on. So it's great, it's wonderful. We can plant a load of wonderful plants and create these really biodiverse habitats, and all being well, you'd be able to just plant that, walk away, and it would be wonderful. But unfortunately, because of the way we've already kind of disrupted certain ecosystems, it is not quite as self-sustaining as it once was, and it requires more active management. So I've mentioned already ragwort being a disagreeable species. Why I've put it in here is that ragwort's something that people actively remove all the time from fields if they have horses or chickens and other livestock, because it can be quite toxic, and it is actually very toxic to certain species, such as horses. But by removing it, what you are doing is removing that plant species, which is a host to multiple species of fungi. There are multiple moths whose larvae, the caterpillars, exclusively eat ragwort. And so if you remove the ragwort, those populations start to plummet. And then what happens is if ragwort grows again, there isn't that natural pest control. There isn't those species of moth to lay their eggs, to have the caterpillars, to remove the ragwort. And as such, ragwort becomes more of a problematic plant and requires more active management. Whereas if those moth populations were able to stabilize, they would actually keep the ragwort level down. I'm going to, just because I'm conscious of time, I'm going to skip past a few of these, but Himalayan balsam, I'm sure many of us are familiar with Himalayan balsam, incredibly prevalent non-native species, and where it grows, it will basically outcompete almost all our native plants, and you end up with these mass carpets of Himalayan balsam, which bees absolutely love them, but it's terrible for our native plant species. And so because our ecosystems haven't adapted to Himalayan balsam as a non-native species, it requires active management, so removal, beating, whatever it may be. A lot of seed mixes that are existing in the soil, so that have been there for a long time, are very grass heavy now because we have quite depleted soils, which means you end up with monocultures, which obviously reduces our biodiversity because it's generally very grass dominant. There are plants like yellow rattle, which you can sow into your seed mixes, that are hemiparasitic, and they take a lot of their nutrients from the grass directly and reduce the amount of grass, allowing more space for other wildflowers to grow. And similarly, now we also have overgrazing is a real problem because we decided to shoot all our wolves and bears and lynx over history. And without those big predators, you get excessive grazing by our herbivorous species like deer. So now active management is required for deer. So if you build it, they will come. Field of dreams. That's the attitude. But as I've said, it is more complex than that nowadays. One of our biggest problems that we face in the UK is we have incredibly fragmented habitats, and working with reptiles as I do, this is probably the biggest threat to most of our reptile species, is that they end up in very small isolated populations because we build a lot of roads, we have a lot of agricultural land, we have less than 7% of the woodlands that we should have or historically have had in the UK is left, and it is mostly in small isolated pockets. As I'm sure we're aware, there's always a small local woodland, which is lovely, but it's not connected to other woodlands. And so whilst we can produce these lovely biodiverse areas, and I think it's really key in local communities when we're improving green spaces, I might skip on to that because I'm aware it is now 12:30. It is really important that we do connect those up. So these slides will be shared with you, and I'm happy to answer any questions by emails. In fact, I think this might be my last slide. I have whizzed through this, so I do hope it's not been too fast or too scatty. You want to make sure I got through it in time. What can we do to improve green spaces and increase biodiversity in our green spaces? So individually, it's about improving those habitats. So particularly from if you've got a garden, I think we're already starting to get past the point now where people want just a clean, manicured grass lawn. A lot of people I know, already they'll have like a little wild area in the corner, and we're quite aware of this. It's something that's become quite prevalent, particularly in terms of hedgehogs. I think hedgehogs are consistently voted our nation's most beloved animal. We all love a hedgehog, and so we're quite aware of providing suitable habitat for them. But things like having a pond makes a huge difference. Having an area that you let grow wild makes a huge difference. Creating shelters, and that could be a pile of logs, a pile of rocks, just something that acts as a shelter for our wildlife, is great. As a community, this is where it gets really important. We can have a wonderful garden optimized for nature, but your garden might be surrounded by fences and might be a long way away from where those animals are. So if you build it, they will come. Only works if they can get there. So this is where the approach of connecting our habitats up. So hedgehog highways, cutting a hole in your fence so the animals can move through, finding ways to link up our habitats and corridors. A lot of local parks, they'll have drainage ditches that might run onto nearby farmland or out of the town. These act as wildlife corridors, and if they can be optimized and improved and made suitable for wildlife to use as a corridor, it links those habitats up, prevents that isolation of our different populations, and that helps connect it all together. And if you're operating from a business level, most businesses, if you have your own premises, will have a bit of green space attached to it. And those bits of green space, you can actively improve yourselves. If you want to sponsor local green spaces, that works really well. And also, we work with a few companies that they do staff volunteer days. So they will allow their staff out, once a quarter or something for a day to volunteer for good causes. And they get involved in kind of active improvements of green spaces and habitats. And it all comes down to this: connection is key. Now, I've zipped through this pretty quickly because I didn't want us to overrun too far. We have slightly, but if anyone does have any questions or wants to follow up on any of this, feel free to ask now, or I can share my email, or Kate can share my email, and that's something we can do. So even though that was a pretty quick whistle-stop tour, I hope it was still interesting and taught you something new.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thanks, Nick. No, I think you've kept to your slot, so don't worry about that. That's awesome. Has anyone got any questions for Nick?
I see Christine's hand up, and Frank. So Christine, I saw yours there. Let me come off sharing so I can.
Mine was actually just an applause, Nick. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much.
Nick, would you do talks for communities?
I certainly do, yes. We can come in and we do a lot of work where I could just come in and talk to a group, or we do like active engagement things where if you've got a green space and you want to, I can come to the green space with whatever community group, maybe work on it, and we can look at it together and discuss things. So if you want my contact details, Frank, I can make sure they're passed on.
Yeah, okay, that's great. I think I've got your email address from Kate, so yeah, that'd be great. Okay.
Okay, thank you. John.
Yeah, hi, Nick. Just to add to that last, your answer to that last question, I just mentioned that my wife and I run an organic wildlife garden, which is open to the public. But once a year in June, we hold a wildlife day, at which 14 specialist charities come, doing bees, pond dipping, bats, owls, and so forth, butterflies, moths, and so on. And they present their commercial interests. And Nick has been kind enough to come to that from time to time. And I can tell you, it is the most popular of all the stands there. Everybody is dying to hold a snake. Not me, of course, but the kids really love it, and they learn a great deal from it. His stand is very, very popular.
Thank you. It's always good fun. I'm hoping to be there this year. I believe, is it the 29th of June this year?
You know more than I do, actually, Nick.
Oh, okay. I'll
yeah.
I think Sunday the 29th of June, I believe, is what I've got in the diary. So if anyone's free on the 29th of June, Stillingfleet Wildlife Day.
Thanks, John. Rosie?
Hi, thanks so much for that. That was really, really interesting. And you've given me absolutely loads to think about. I do lots and lots of work with young people and with schools. And I just wondered what sort of radius you work in with schools.
All across the northeast, really. I do everything as far as I've done workshops in Liverpool, Suffolk, all over. So I have gone all around the UK, but we're based in Rickle, actually, so just outside York, between York and Selby. But as long as we can get there, I'm quite happy to do wherever.